plan that was the chronological plan. You maybe remember me saying that back in January, and I've been working through it chronologically. One of the interesting things when you read through chronologically, and I don't mean Genesis to Revelations, it's Genesis, and sometimes it gets interspersed. The books of our Bible don't always run in chronological order. But one of the interesting things that stood out to me was how long it took to get to the New Testament. Do you know what day was the first day of New Testament readings in my chronological plan? October 1st, right? So that's 3/4 of the year taken up with the Old Testament. That's how vast the Old Testament is, and part of the reason why we spend so much time preaching the Old Testament. But as we come into this story of Israel, the story of the kings, and the conclusion of the story of the kings, I want to just take a moment and help you to see how well you know your Bible. Who does the story of Israel begin with? Who is the first of the patriarchs? His name is Abraham, right? And God says to Abraham, go to the place I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed, right? And so we have Abraham, and he has a son, Isaac, that's right, call him out, and then Jacob, right? And Jacob goes and ends up with 2 wives and lots of trouble and 2 concubines on top of the 2 wives and 12 children. One of them is Joseph, and Joseph gets sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. And so, by the Lord's providential hand, all of Israel ends up in Egypt and is in Egypt for 400 years, right? And so along comes who? Moses, that's right. And Moses, the Lord uses him to lead them out. And so we get Moses. Moses is followed by Joshua. Joshua leads them into the promised land. Joshua is followed by the judges. Things get darker and darker and darker. The final judge is a man named Samuel. And Samuel is sent to anoint a king. And so then we get the kings. We get Saul, who is a one-off king, and he is set aside by the Lord. And then we get the great king, David, and his son Solomon. And David is the one who conquers Jerusalem, and Solomon is the one who puts up the temple. You know all this stuff, right? You can tell this story, how it all fits together. And then we get into the age of kings that we've been looking at, the division of the kingdom, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and in the north things go from bad to worse to worse to worse until finally Assyria comes and swallows them all up. And in the south, things kind of go up and down. They undulate between good kings and bad kings, and they get an extra 100 years of history. But ultimately, we come to this point where Babylon comes. This is a moment of grave finality in the life of Israel. The Israelites who witnessed this, Jeremiah, one of the Israelites who witnessed this, the man who wrote most extensively of these final days, it is etched upon his memory. Jeremiah sees it in his sleep. He closes his eyes and he sees the fall of Jerusalem over and over again. He writes a 5-chapter book called the Book of Lamentations. We're going to look at a few of his laments today. There are moments of finality in life. There is finality if you've ever seen your home burn down. There's a sense of finality there, a loss that cannot be regained. There's a sense of finality in words like stage 4 cancer. You hear that and you say, this is the end of something. The signature on divorce paper has a sense of finality. There is finality at the graveside where fresh soil marks the resting place of a family member. And here on this final chapter of the Book of Kings, there is a sense of finality. Things that had once been, things that were once great, things that were once glorious, things that were once coveted and boasted in and celebrated and rejoiced, things like the temple, things like Jerusalem, things like the high priest, things like the Davidic kings, all of these things. It's the end of everything. Jeremiah writes in his beginning of Lamentations, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. I think he must have written those words during the 3-week period, a period that the modern day Jews remember as the what do they call it? They call it between dire straits. The 3 weeks between dire straits, the time between when the walls are breached and when everything comes to an end. Jeremiah records two versions. It's interesting. The book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 52, the very end of the book of Jeremiah, he has the chapter that we just read from the book of Kings verbatim, to the point that some people make the premise that perhaps Jeremiah is actually the chronicler who writes all of these books for us: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That's a plausible explanation. Jeremiah certainly lifts the final chapter of 2nd Kings and includes it entirely in his prophecy, Jeremiah chapter 52. But he has another account in Jeremiah chapter 39. I want to read you just a few verses from Jeremiah 39 because it adds a little bit of color to the account that we've already read. The Babylonians have come up and for 18 months have laid siege to Jerusalem. They've literally built siege ramps all the way around the city and sealed the city off. No one goes in, nobody comes out. And here's how Jeremiah describes the end in Jeremiah 39. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, on the 9th day of the month, a breach was made in the city. Then all the officials of the king of Babylon came and sat in the middle gate. Nergal-Sarezer of Samgar, Nebu-Sarsekim, the Rabsaris, Nergal-Sarezer, the Rabmag, with all the rest of the officers of the king of Babylon. You get this picture in your mind. There's actually two portions of the city of Jerusalem. There's the upper portion, and there's the lower portion. The lower portion is the one that is breached. And when the breach happens, like a victorious football team posing on the opponent's field for a photo, all of the commanders come pouring in. They don't immediately go about the work of destroying anything. They've gotten into the city. They've been working on it for 18 months. They set up their seats right in front of the middle gate, and they sit down. That picture is a mockery of one that was taken 500 years earlier with David and the men of his day, and we read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here. The blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft and attack those lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul." Therefore it is said, "The blind and the lame shall not come into the house." And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Milo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. Inside this city, there are many great structures, and particularly the great walls that if they were in our day, would be designated with one of those little brass heritage structure plaques. They would say, "David was here. David slept here. David built this. David put his hand here. David was all over this. This is the city of David. David won it. David established it. David fortified it." It is directly aligned with the Davidic line. One of David's great ancestors, Hezekiah, who we heard about not too many weeks ago, anticipating an Assyrian siege, had prepared the waterworks in such a way to stand up to a siege, and it did a great job, because for 18 months the Babylonians surrounded the city and the water held. But food became the issue. After 18 months, the food had run out, the people were starving. Jeremiah writes extensively in his prophecy about this. Jeremiah spent those 18 months within the city of Jerusalem. He talks about how gaunt and thin the people are, their skin having darkened and grown tight from hunger. He says they almost looked like they were made from wood. Even the mother's nursing milk had dried up, and a starving army cannot fend off a well-fed army. And so on the 9th day of the 4th month of Zedekiah's 11th year, the breach is made in the lower wall. The Babylonians come pouring in. They set up their chairs. They pose for that final victorious image. The upper city is still intact. That's where the palace is. That's where the temple is. That's where the king is. But knowing that if the king falls, the kingdom falls, the men decide that very night that they will escape. They go out through the garden gate, the king, his sons, along with the rest of the army, whoever is able, and they flee away, hoping they'll make it north to Jericho, but the Chaldeans are waiting for them, and they take them captive. And so begins the final 3 weeks of Jerusalem. The saddest festival in modern-day Judaism is a day called Tisha B'Av, and it's a 25-hour fast that happens sometime between July and August that marks the fall of Jerusalem. It's the end of a 3-week festival called Between Dire Straits that marks the 3 weeks in which Jerusalem stood with the Babylonians sitting within it. For 3 weeks, the starving citizens of Jerusalem wait to discover their fate. And there are 7 distinct steps in these final days. I want you to hear these. The Bible lays them out for us. The first step in these 3 weeks is the end of the Davidic line. Zedekiah, who has fled away but was captured along with his sons, is brought before Nebuchadnezzar, placed in bronze shackles and chains, and then his sons are brought before him in a unbelievably brutal way. He has to watch as each of his sons is killed. And then to ensure that he never sees another thing after that, they put out his eyes and carry him a captive to Babylon. This is meant to send the signal, there will be no more Davidic kings. This is the end. We've killed them all. Second, we read that the Babylonians round up the most prominent, most outstanding men in the city. They take the high priest and his assistant, the second to the high priest. They take the 3 gatekeepers who are the heads of the 3 Levitical families. They take the secretary of the army and the head of the army. They take 5 of the king's counselors who are found there in the city. They find 60 other men, the most prominent men of business, the most likely men that you would seek out to give wisdom or guidance. They bring them before Nebuchadnezzar, and they systematically murder every one of those 72 men. This is the end of hope for Israel. And now every article in the temple is brought out. The richest treasures have already been carried away a number of years earlier, but those heavy articles, those enormous things, those things that Solomon has built, the great sea, which is many, many feet across and holds a vast amount of water made of bronze, these pillars that are 30 feet high, made out of bronze, they bring these out, and what value have they got? Well, they're bronze. Bronze isn't valuable like gold or silver, but they have meaning because Solomon cast them. They've stood there all these years, and they break them in pieces, and they pile them onto wagons, and they drag those things away to Babylon. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 10, reflecting on this, Jeremiah says, "The enemy has stretched out his hand over all her precious things. For as she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation." Fourth, the great houses and the palaces are now burnt to the ground. Anything that could be considered worth anything is destroyed, especially if it's something of significance. If David or Solomon ever touched the stone of a building, it was pulled down and burned. No one would ever be able again to point to a historic place in Jerusalem and say, here is this thing and is there to this day. It's not there to this day. It's gone. It's pulled down. It's burned. It's destroyed. The parallel, I suppose, would be if you're from Simcoe to see somebody pull down the Caroline Tower and to burn the town hall and to tear down all of the high-standing church steeples and anything that you ever identified and said, this is something, this is my town, this is what makes it my town, this is what makes it of significance. All of that is gone. It's destroyed. All that's left are the little houses and the hovels. And finally, the temple itself is set alight and burned to the ground. This structure, which took 40 years to complete, this structure, which amazingly, as you read the story, Solomon so worked it. David had gathered the resources for years to build the temple, and Solomon spent his entire reign building it, but it went up silently. He worked it in such a way that the stonemasons worked outside of the city, and the stones were brought, and so day by day the temple grew and grew and grew with nary a sound coming, and all of that comes crashing down in a couple of days. Nothing but rubble and smoke. Lamentations chapter 2, verse 6. The Lord has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. The Lord has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath, and in his fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. And later on in Lamentations chapter 4, verse 1, we read of what the streets of Jerusalem look like. He says, the holy stones, the stones of the temple, lie scattered at the head of every street. Sixth, the final thing the people see if Jerusalem is the Babylonian army systematically pulling down the walls, tearing off the gates, and setting them on fire. It must have taken the better part of 3 weeks to complete that work, to destroy an entire city, to take all of its fortifications and destroy it. And we know how completely Jerusalem was destroyed because 70 years later, when Nehemiah returns with a mandate to rebuild the walls, he can't even ride his horse through the streets. He has to get off and walk because the rubble that has been created by the destruction of Jerusalem 70 years earlier makes it impassable. And finally, all but the poorest of the poor are queued up and set to walk all the way to Babylon, where they will live the rest of their lives as exiles. Some of these little boys that we sent out for Sunday school, some of those little boys, if they were there on this day, some of those little boys will one day see Jerusalem again. But when they see Jerusalem again, they'll be old men with sore backs and sore knees, and they'll weep when they look at the replacement temple that Zerubbabel puts up, because it's nothing compared to the one that was there before. These 7 steps take place over these 3 weeks. The destruction of the Davidic line, the murder of the high priest, the Levites, and the leaders of the people, the destruction of the furnishings of the temple, the burning of the entire city's palaces and houses, the destruction of the temple itself, the tearing down of the walls, the burning of the gates, and the deportation of the people. Finally, there is nothing left. This place, there is not even a glimmer of light. There is not a modicum of movement. Nothing lives in Jerusalem for the next 70 years. Even when Ezra comes back to rebuild the temple, and he comes back before Nehemiah comes back to build the walls, he reports that nobody lives in the city. They're trying to rebuild the temple. Nobody lives there. It's unlivable. There's no place to live. There's no defense against any roving band of bandits. That's the Babylonians' idea, is to destroy once and for all Jerusalem, to bring it to an end. And yet not even this is the final degradation. Gedaliah, a Jewish nobleman, is made governor over the little remnant that is left behind. And it's interesting because Gedaliah sets up at Mizpah. You go, why does he set up at Mizpah? Because there is no more Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed. And so at Mizpah, which is a smaller city in Judah, Gedaliah sets up as governor. The Babylonians appoint him to gather into himself the little straggling bits of people that make their way back. But even Gedaliah, you can read about this in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah warns him, Nathaniah, the Ishmaelite, is coming to kill you. And Gedaliah is a trusting man and a good man, doesn't believe him, doesn't take any precautions, and sure enough, Nathaniah, the Ishmaelite, comes and assassinates Gedaliah, assassinates all the leaders he has with him, assassinates the Babylonians who have been left behind, and the remnant of the Jews, terrified at what the Babylonians will do when they hear of this, defy Jeremiah and flee from Judah. In the most surprising plot twist imaginable, the children of Abraham, at the end of the book of Kings, retrace their steps all the way to Egypt. And so as the book of Kings ends, there are no Jews living in the promised land. There is no temple in the promised land. There is no king in the promised land. There is no priest in the promised land. There is no city in the promised land. Everything is gone. It has been scraped clean. Such is the effect of the curse of Deuteronomy for breaking covenant. God has carried his wrath to the fullest extent. It's pretty bleak. But there is a little glimmer of hope that we find right at the end. The final four verses. I'll read them to you again. It's interesting, before I read these to you, I tell you a little. Jeremiah is an eyewitness of these things and records it in the book of Jeremiah and in the book of Lamentations. Ezekiel, who is a prophet who is a contemporary with Jeremiah, is also a witness of these things, though he doesn't see them in person because he was carried away in an earlier deportation. He is on in Susa, in the Babylonian Empire, on the Kebar Canal, and he has visions. The Lord shows him in visions the destruction of Jerusalem. He knows on the very first day that the Babylonians show up. And one of the fascinating visions of Ezekiel's the one who sees the glory of the Lord sitting high upon a throne that is on a platform that is being carried by 4 cherubim who have got wheels that are going around. And in his vision, Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord. And you remember when Solomon completed the temple, the glory of the Lord came with such power that the people couldn't even go into the temple when the glory of the Lord came upon it. He says, I saw the glory of the Lord rise up, and it came out to the very edge of the threshold of the temple to the eastern side, and then it lifted up, and he said, I saw the glory depart from the temple. He sees that in a vision. What's really interesting is the direction that the glory of the Lord goes. The Lord's glory departs from the temple but goes to the east. The east is where the people of God have been taken as exiles. And there's a message hidden there in Ezekiel that even though the Lord is departing from the temple, this place where he said, I will cause my name to dwell there, he's not abandoning his people. They may be in captivity and exile, but the Lord is going that way. In the very end of our book, and in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in that year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison, and he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the king who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table, and for his allowance a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. Here's this glimmer of hope. Who is this Jehoiachin? Do you remember him? He only reigned for 3 months. He was Jehoiakim's son. He came to the throne right before the Babylonians showed up and deposed him and raised up his uncle Zedekiah and put him on the throne. And so the destruction of the Davidic line, the death of Zedekiah and all of his sons, is not actually the destruction of the Davidic line, because there is one Davidic son who was taken away captive into Babylon 11 years earlier. And here in the 37th year of his exile, he's raised up. The book of Chronicles tells us that he had 7 sons. And so in this surprising additional plot twist, we read his son, he had a son, and his eldest son was Shealtiel. And we read of Shealtiel in the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, when we pick up in Matthew chapter 1, verse 12. Listen to this. And after the deportation to Babylon, pause there for a moment. After the end of all these things, after the end of everything, after the destruction of the city, of the temple, of the priestly line, of the king, of the leaders of the people, after the loss of all hope, after the closing of this chapter, after the people have been withdrawn, so they're even back in Egypt, after the deportation to Babylon, God is not done, and hope is not lost. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was father to Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel the father of Abiad, and Abiad the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliad, and Eliad the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. It is the closing of a chapter in the history of Israel, but it is not the end of the story of Israel. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthians, writes to the Corinthians that God has chosen the weak things in this world to shame the strong. He's chosen the foolish things in this world to shame the wise. Friends, God works most often in the most unlikely ways, through the small people, through the weak people, through the people who everybody else thinks foolish, in order to bring about his purpose. Even in the midst of collapse and failure, God is not powerless. God has plans and purposes, and he will accomplish them. And this is the story of Kings. Let's pray. Father,